Find the inverse of f of x equals radical negative x plus 3 minus 1. Okay, so there's a four-step process here in order to find the equation of the inverse. The first step says let's replace f of x with y. So y equals negative x plus 3 minus 1. Okay, the second step says every y becomes an x, every x becomes a y. Okay, so we can go ahead and do that, right? So this y became an x, this x became a y. Okay, the third step is the key step, right? We want to get y by itself now. Okay, we want to solve for y. So let's add this one to both sides. Okay, so x plus 1 equals radical negative y plus 3. Let's switch these sides, okay? A lot of people, or a lot of students like the y being on the left side, so I'm going to switch the sides around. And here's the key step, right? We want to get y by itself as a radical, so I'm going to square both sides, okay? So once I square the left side, and once I square the right side, okay, I get negative y plus 3 equals x plus 1 quantity squared, okay? So now I can subtract 3 to both sides, right? So I'm going to subtract the 3 here. And what's the last thing we have to do, right? Well, we don't want a negative, right? So I'm just going to divide everything by negative 1, okay? So y is going to equal the negative of x plus 1 squared. And when I multiply this by negative, that becomes a plus 3. All right, so this, now the last step, I mean, we don't really need to write it, right? But this is the equation for our inverse function, right? So this is f inverse of x right here. Now let's take a look, right? For our function f of x, what is the domain of this function here? Okay, so the domain, now we know this is a radical function, right? And we know that we cannot end up with a negative inside the radical, okay? So the domain is going to be negative infinity up till positive 3, okay? And I know that if once I plug in a number bigger than 3 in here, right, then I'm going to get a negative radical, so that's no good, okay? What is the range of this function, though? Okay, the range of this function is negative 1 to infinity. And I know that because of this minus 1 here. Essentially, it's shifted down 1 unit. Okay, so we can call that range negative 1 to infinity. But think about what that means, right? Well, for the inverse function, right? For the inverse function, the domain then should be negative 1 to infinity. And the range should be negative infinity to 3. Okay. So you're probably looking at this and saying, well, okay, this is a quadratic function, right? How come my domain is only from negative 1 to infinity, right? How come, I mean, I should be able to plug in any value of x and get an answer, right? But the key is that we are dealing with inverse functions, and in this case, we have the radical function here, right? So we essentially have to restrict the domain of this guy in order to ensure that it has this inverse, okay? So you got to make sure, especially when you're dealing with radical functions, okay, you got to make sure that you look at the domain and range of the inverse carefully.